This is Jeff Rogers with Channel 6 Central Kentucky Television and this edition of Political Focus. On this program, we provide our viewers with an opportunity to learn more about the candidates who are seeking elected office in our region and across the state of Kentucky. As we know, the COVID-19 pandemic has moved Kentucky's primary back 1 month, so the primary will this year be held on Tuesday, June 23rd. In addition to the presidential primary, Kentuckians will have the opportunity to vote for candidates for the U.S. Senate. Our guest today is Mike Broihier. He is one of 10 Democrats seeking to challenge Mitch McConnell in the fall general election. Mr. Broihier is a farmer, a teacher, a former newspaper editor, and a retired Marine Lieutenant Colonel who lives in Lincoln County. Welcome, Mike.
It is absolutely my pleasure to be here, Jeff. This is great, and I'm really looking forward to talking to you and your viewers today.
So, Mike, could we begin by talking a little bit about what led you to decide to run for the U.S. Senate, and then maybe just a little bit more about you?
Well, Jeff, you mentioned that I'm a retired Marine Lieutenant Colonel. I'm also married to a retired Marine. So you can imagine how tough our son's life was, having both mom and dad being Marines. But, we both spent our lives, our adult lives in service to the nation and with an oath sworn to protect the Constitution. And, my wife and I have been farming here in Lincoln County for the last 15 years. We've been growing increasingly alarmed over the last several years about what I saw a slide towards authoritarianism in Washington. A rejection of all those things we learned in middle school civics about the separation of powers, checks and balances, co-equal branches of government. For me, I think, and for my wife, because this was a joint decision before we embarked on this journey, was that Donald Trump is a symptom. And career politicians like Mitch McConnell, who are interested only in consolidating their power and in gaining wealth at the cost of the future of the republic, the Constitution, and the people of the Commonwealth. It was that realization that caused me to want to get into this fight. And you talked about my background. I saw myself as uniquely positioned to take the fight to Mitch McConnell, as someone who is a retired veteran, someone who's a legitimate, dirt under the fingernails farmer here in Kentucky, and someone who is taught at the one of the finest universities in the nation, but also a substitute teach in the Lincoln County Public Schools. Mitch McConnell has never seen anything like that. To get rid of him, to free the republic of him, to free the Senate from his grip, requires somebody who's not your typical Kentucky politician who may run against him.
So in thinking about how this pandemic has impacted our nation, how has it impacted your sense of the role of government and what you might hope to do as Kentucky's senator?
The foundation of our nation is a federalist system with the states being considered heavily in how government is run in the nation and granting great autonomy to the 50 states and to their governors. But in times of crisis, like a war or a pandemic, it's the chance and the moment for federal government to step up and say, this threatens all of us. This is a threat to our economy, to the health of our population. And so what I've seen is an abject failure in leadership out of Washington. In my campaign, the themes that I had in my campaign about social and economic justice, starting back last July, only became in more stark relief during this pandemic. As someone who's a retired Marine, when I was teaching at the University of California, one of my classes was leadership and management. So I'm a student of leadership. And to hear the President of the United States say, I have absolute authority, but I accept zero responsibility, should be jarring to anybody who's been responsible for anything, from coaching a little league team to being a shift manager at McDonald's to running a large corporation. That fundamental misunderstanding about the role of leadership and the responsibility of leadership should really be alarming to anyone in the face of this pandemic.
Speaking sort of about the economy and the impact, that obviously this pandemic has had a crushing impact on our national economy, Kentucky's economy, and particularly Kentucky's unemployment rate. We know Congress has taken some action to provide stimulus and relief. Many say that's not been enough. What do you sort of envision as what Congress needs to do next to provide stimulus and relief for Kentucky?
Well, I think first of all, the leadership needs to come from the executive branch. The president likes to style himself a wartime president, but if he wants to be a wartime president, he needs to act like one. And he's talked about the Defense Production Act, but he needs to use it. And he needs to marshal the great resources of our nation, whether it's research on a vaccine or it's directing industries to produce PPE, the material, gowns, masks, gloves, ventilators, respirators that the country needs to fight this pandemic, and then appoint a logistician, say an Army supply chain manager. We have brilliant people working in the Department of Defense who move things around the globe every single day. Put one person in charge and say, we will get the material to where it's needed, when it's needed. That's the first thing. We need to pass an emergency universal basic income, because this one-time check for $1,200, that, for example, our check just arrived this week. To get one check for $1,200 when folks are facing not being able to pay their rent, pay their mortgage, make their car payment, unemployment, is ridiculous. We need to have a full-time emergency UBI, say $2,000 a month per adult, $1,000 per child, through the whole course of the recession or depression that is inevitably going to follow this pandemic. And then at that point, we need to transition to a permanent UBI. In my proposal, I worked out with a internationally respected author on UBI, a guy named Scott Santens, who writes for the World Economic Forum, of $1,200 a month and $400 per child, because to stimulate the economy, to get things moving, to relieve the immiseration of our people, putting cash in the hands of the middle class, the working class, the working poor, is the best way to do all of these things.
Sort of related to that, you have stated on your website that one of the first pieces of legislation you would like to introduce is the Harlan County Coal Miners Act. Can you speak a little bit about the priority there and what you hope that legislation would do?
Well, I think that it just represents fundamental fairness. One thing, you mentioned earlier that I was a rural journalist, and for 2 years I was a reporter. 3 years I was the editor of the third oldest newspaper in Kentucky, very, very rural, conservative part of Kentucky. But people in Kentucky have got a keen sense of fairness. They have a keen sense of justice. And the Harlan County Miners Act grew out of the time I spent out with the miners from the Black Jewel mine. And I have to tell you, I was standing on the tracks the day CSX took their locomotives out, their engines out. And they arrived at the protest site early in the morning and said, we'd really like to get our trains back. And the miners said, great, you can have your trains back, but not a piece of coal. And so late, very, very late in that day, standing on the tracks with the miners, their families, the folks who'd come to support them from around the country. And when the trains were coming out with no coal, I just to this day, I get goosebumps thinking about that moment. Right now, I have goosebumps thinking about the beauty of that moment. And what I came away from that event was the idea that when a company goes bankrupt, the very, very first people that need to be paid are the workers. And that is the gist of the Harlan County Miners Act, is that a company goes bankrupt, the workers get paid, their pension fund gets paid, their benefits get paid, and then everyone else down the food chain. Workers first, people first, humanity first.
So while this current pandemic has created a public health crisis, some would suggest our nation's healthcare system was already not working for many Americans. Can you talk a little bit about your thinking about the idea of Medicare for all?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, it was not working. And the problem was that the people who were not receiving any health care were basically invisible to the people in Washington. They are people that they do not care about, largely the poor, largely people of color. It doesn't matter to people in Washington. But when you put over 30 million Americans on unemployment in a month, and you have 30 million American households probably without healthcare in the face of the largest healthcare crisis in a century, all of a sudden they start paying attention when their fear is that the Senate gym is going to be looted for toilet paper and hand sanitizer. And when they make decisions to save their jobs, that's not leadership, that's self-preservation. But we need to have bold ideas. And what I've been saying since last July is we need to build a true single-payer healthcare system. We need to learn from best practices of countries who've done this before, Canada, Australia. Now, both those countries have got, they built single-payer healthcare systems, and we can learn from them. We don't have to copy them. And before the pandemic, I was all for keeping the Affordable Care Act, offering a public option until we could build the single-payer healthcare system. Now this pandemic's hit, and we have tens of millions of American households without healthcare. I absolutely am for blowing open Medicare and offering it to all, and covering them throughout this pandemic until we can build a real single-payer healthcare system.
Scientists have raised concerns that climate change is having serious negative impacts around the globe and here in Kentucky as well. So I wondered, for you as a farmer, how are you experiencing these environmental changes? And then as a U.S. Senator, what actions do you think need to be taken to address this global concern?
My wife and I have an all-natural asparagus farm. I believe it was Mother's Day weekend. We had a freeze, not just a heavy frost, but a freeze, 26 degrees overnight, 2 nights in a row. And we basically turned probably $800 worth of asparagus back into the ground. Now, as a small farmer with a small growing season, to create the world's most incredible, expensive compost hurts. It really, really hurts. And so to have, in the first week of May, this cold weather was coming, and I was outside in May picking asparagus in the snow to try to get something in before we lost all of it. Climate change is real, and for us as small farmers, we're very, very fortunate because as a retired Marine, we have an additional income. That's fine. It gives us a little bit of padding, but there are other farmers in the state who don't have that. If you go out to southwestern Kentucky, you go out to the Four Rivers area near Paducah, they are suffering year after year, whether it's excessive drought or excessive rain, invasive species. As the climate changes, it is getting harder and harder and harder for small farmers, for Kentucky farmers to exist and to sustain their way of life, for their children to remain farming. And what happens is they end up getting rolled up into large, giant agribusiness farms. And as we're seeing now during the pandemic, that those kind of stovepipe agricultural systems are a threat to delivering food to the American people. And so I believe in small farms. I believe in family farms because they're good wardens of the environment, and they also add to our biodiversity, and they add to our food security. Now, to the larger question about climate change, I have a plan for recovering from this pandemic, and that's based on large-scale infrastructure projects. And I've been reaching out to candidates in adjoining states. There are 8 coal producing Appalachian states, and I've already been reaching out to progressive candidates and getting them to sign on to a plan that I call a just transition to a green economy, where all of us go to DC together as a block, and we don't ask, but we tell. We said, you, federal government, have let the energy companies off the hook. They are not coming back to clean up the environmental disaster. They're not coming up to clean up the economic disaster. So the federal government needs to do it. And we'll go to DC as a block. We will turn Appalachia into a green energy producing region for the entire eastern half of the United States. We'll reforest the surface mines that are too geologically unstable to support any kind of industry, but we'll bring infrastructure, rural broadband, drinkable water, roads, bridges, et cetera, into this area, and industry follows infrastructure. And so in addition to the jobs created through this, green energy project, industry will follow. There'll be jobs for the people who are working there now, their children, their grandchildren. And if you happen to believe in global climate change, like I do, you put a giant dent in the carbon footprint in the United States, as we switch over to green energy.
So Kentucky's governor and Secretary of State have authorized new, broader vote-by-mail options for the June 23rd primary. A number of states do this routinely to ensure that voters can fully participate in their elections. Can you speak to your views about this idea of voting by mail? And then maybe further, could you speak to your ideas about voter rights in general?
Well, I think you just have to look to the reaction of the president when he saw in the first CARES Act that there was support for mail-in voting. And he said words to the effect of, oh my God, if they do this, no Republican will ever get elected again. And, it was a rare moment of clarity and truth for the president when he acknowledged the fact that mail-in voting is a great tool in fighting voter suppression. It's a great tool in fighting gerrymandering. It causes greater voter turnout. And it also causes there to be more informed voters. I was talking to a supporter from Oregon the other day, and they've done mail-in voting in Oregon for a decade, exclusively mail-in voting. She told me that you can sit at home and with a cup of coffee at your kitchen table with your partner, you can go through your ballot, you can Google people, you can go through your voter guide. And while many of us are aware of the people on the very, very top of the ballot, those critical jobs on the down ballot, many of us don't really know everything about it. And so mail-in voting gives voters, before the pandemic, incredible luxury of time to be a more informed voter. But now during the time of the pandemic, it could very possibly save their life. It's secure, it increases voter turnout, and that's why the GOP hates it so much.
So in your campaign materials, you describe yourself as a progressive. Can you talk a little bit about what being progressive means to you and how those values impact your decision-making as a U.S. Senator?
Labels are tough, and they really are a tool that are used to separate people. But in reality, my views are very, very progressive. I think a lot of people look at a retired military officer, and both my wife and I are retired military officers, and they expect you to be some kind of MAGA hat wearing, chest thumper, howling about a border wall. And, one of two things happens when you do a career in service and you see the things that my wife and I have seen. I guess your heart can get harder or your heart can get softer. And mine has definitely over the decades grown softer and maybe more compassionate person. I think that's probably why I was ultimately endorsed by former presidential candidate Marianne Williamson, because she realized that at the core of my platform was people and their value and respecting their dignity and supporting them and allowing them to live their most potential. And then I began picking up support from the Indivisible movement, the Pennyrile Indivisible, and then Southeastern Kentucky, then Northern Kentucky, and finally the Kentucky State chapter out of Louisville said, this is our guy. And then, just last week, former presidential candidate Andrew Yang endorsed my campaign, and Humanity Forward, his organization he founded after his presidential campaign. And it is incredibly affirming that people with good hearts who respect the worth of all life, the worth of all labor, not just that compensated labor, that tells me that I'm on the right track. And these were all things that I was for before the pandemic struck, but now during this time of crisis, it's even more important. And it lets me believe that I am absolutely on the right track. And I think it's a message that will really stick with the voters of Kentucky.
As a substitute teacher, I imagine you've seen up close a number of the challenges faced by teachers in Kentucky and our school system. And I wonder what actions you might advocate for as a senator to help our education system.
Let me talk to you about being a substitute teacher. On Friday afternoons in our schools, particularly our primary elementary schools, there's a room. And as the children leave the school, they stop by the room and they pick up a backpack. And that backpack is full of food. Because if they didn't pick up that backpack, they would not have another meal until they showed up to school on Monday morning. And those backpacks are assembled by parents, by volunteers, by teachers paying out of their own pockets. And if you think about it, Jeff, that we are the wealthiest nation in the history of the world. And we have to send our students home, our children home, with a backpack of food so they got something to eat before they come back to school the following Monday. That should enrage you. That should enrage the voters of this country, that is where we are at, that we are so callous and so focused on money and the stock market as the sole indicators of the wealth of our nation, or the economic health of our nation. And I think this pandemic has shown that there are a million holes in that system because, all indicators of the economy's health, the stock market, has been driven into the ditch by the president and the Senate Majority Leader. And so as someone who advocates a single-payer healthcare system and universal basic income, I don't want there to be another day where a child has got to pick up a backpack of food so they have something to eat over the weekend until they come back to school. That's not the job of our public schools to feed our poor children. That's the job of our community. It's the job of our parents. And so that's why I support UBI, to relieve that. I want to craft a generous and kind and concerned society because we can afford it.
And so if our viewers wanted to know more about your campaign, how could they do that?
It's easy. You can go to my website, mike4ky.com, spelled out Mike, Forky.com. And there's an issues page. My policy on universal basic income, which is a difficult thing for a lot of people to understand. I had help of some very, very bright people, particularly this guy named Scott Santens, who writes for the World Economic Forum, in actually crafting a plan on how to enact and how to actually pay for a universal basic income. And so it's one thing to say, hey, I'm for this great, progressive idea, but it's another to have a real plan with the facts behind it, with the math behind it on how to do it. So mike4ky.com. And then from there are videos, there's an issues page. And also if people are so inclined, they can donate, obviously. But more importantly to me right now is a chance to sign up. And you hit that sign up button, and I promise you, they will put you to work.
So Mike, I wondered if there were any other topics or issues that you wanted to make sure that Channel 6 residents and voters knew about?
Well, Jeff, first thing I'll say is thank you so much for spending time with me. I think what people need to be aware of here in Kentucky is that there is a primary on the Democratic side. There's an opportunity to select a candidate who can beat Mitch McConnell, that can break his stranglehold on the Senate with bills that have passed out of the House with wide bipartisan support, and that Mitch McConnell's blocked because he gets paid, whether it's the gun lobby or the oil industry. We need to break the stranglehold. We need to create an opportunity for progress. And so your viewers do not have to accept the Washington Democrats party line about who to vote for. There are great choices. I'm one of them. And I'm the person who can beat Mitch McConnell because I can compete in all corners of Kentucky. As a veteran, as a teacher, as a farmer, I'm the guy they know, and I'm the guy they trust. And I'm the guy who can beat Mitch McConnell.
Thank you so much, Mike. We've enjoyed having you with us today on Channel 6.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much, Jeff.
This is Jeff Rogers for Channel 6 Central Kentucky Television. Thank you for tuning in to this edition of Political